Coming up next, coverage of a discussion entitled President Bush's Hypocrisy and the New World Order. The featured speaker on the program held last night was Michael Parenti, author of several books including Democracy for the Few, The Sword and the Dollar, and the soon-to-be-published Make-Believe Media, The Politics of Entertainment. The event was sponsored by the organization Women's Strike for Peace and was held as a benefit for organizations that are working to bring medical and humanitarian aid to Iraq.
On behalf of Women's Strike for Peace, AMERT, and the Gulf Peace Team, to a benefit lecture to benefit the relief organizations, a couple of the relief organizations doing work in Iraq to help the victims in Iraq. I'm with Women's Strike for Peace. My name is Lynn Fredrickson. Women's Strike for Peace has been working for disarmament and just foreign policy for 30 years, and we're very happy tonight to be here with you. And I would like to introduce now Joan Drake, who is with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She was on a delegation to Iraq, the International Women's Gulf Peace Initiative before the war, and she was recently in New York for a hearing of the War Crimes Tribunal against U.S. crimes against Iraq. Joan.
Hello. Thanks very much, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight and to try, I think, to assess what's been happening to our country, what's been happening to the world over these past few months and years since the tensions in the Gulf mounted and culminated in the terrible bombardment of the people of Iraq and Kuwait during this past several months. I'd like to say that the privilege I had in being in Iraq prior to the bombing is one which I regard with great honor. It was quite honorific to be there at that time. I had the opportunity to see the tremendous work that had been done by the government and by the people of Iraq to repair the damage from the war that they had just come out of after finishing off a whole series of completed renovations and reworking of the infrastructure of the country. In early January of 1991, Iraq was a busy and bustling nation. I can tell you that the streets and highways were better than our own. There was hardly a pothole to be seen. The various governmental systems and agencies that I had a chance to visit, and the non-governmental agencies, and particularly the women's organizations of Iraq, were busy and were trying very hard to avert the war catastrophe that they felt was coming, but that they hoped would not emerge. And I think that those of us here tonight, and many of us in the international community, were feeling that it would probably resolve itself somewhat in the way that the Cuban Missile Crisis had resolved in 1962, that in the wisdom of world leaders, it would be seen that the sensible thing to do was to avoid war and destruction and to concern oneself and one's nation and the international community as a whole with the preservation of life rather than its destruction. Sadly, that didn't happen. And we're here tonight to try to repair some of the damage, to try to ameliorate some of the injury caused by our nation, by our tax dollars, and by our inability to inject ourselves into the halls of power in such a way that democracy is realized in our day, in our nation, for our time. And I just want to say it's a privilege and an honor to be here with each one of you tonight, because as I look out amongst this audience, I see people who have worked so hard within these recent months and also within past years on the great issues of our day. And I want to just say I think it's worth a round of applause to congratulate each one of you. And I think you should applaud yourselves because we tend to measure our achievements by what we haven't accomplished. And I think that's a grave error. I think we've seen just in the past several months the building of a massive movement in this country that is trying desperately to bring the country into the 21st century in a sensible and sane fashion. And I think among the people who have most taken this to heart and who have much to contribute to the process is Professor Michael Parenti. And I want you to know, I think it's an honor to be here with you tonight and an honor to share this podium with him. And I'd like to say that I think it's a great privilege to introduce to you so distinguished a speaker as Professor Michael Parenti. And you know, I thought a lot about coming here tonight, as you all did, planning for the evening, trying to get everything straight so I'd be here, and over the past several days, thinking back to all the great words and works of Michael Parenti. And one book that I pulled off my shelf among the many of his that I have read, and that perhaps all of you have read, was his book, Democracy for the Few. And this book is 20 years old, and here I have this old, worn out paperback that I understand is the first edition, but from what I heard, there are 5 subsequent editions of this book. So it's clear that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, have read or know of the words in this book, Democracy for the Few, by Michael Parenti, published in 1973. But I want to read just a few words from this book to you, and to say it reads as if it were written today. So we have with us not only a scholar and a gentleman, but a prophet. We have with us tonight Michael Parenti, and those of you who are familiar with his work will know that he has earned all the distinguished titles that American academia affords, namely his PhD in political science from Yale University in 1962, teaching at a number of colleges and universities, and serving as guest professor of political science at many of them. And these universities include Howard University, University of Canterbury, New Zealand, distinguished residence professor at California State University. And you know, I understand that he's going off to London later this year, and that he'll be doing a tour in Europe, and it couldn't be more timely. So we're very privileged to have him with us tonight, and it's clear that he brings an international perspective to his work. Among the books that I didn't bring along with me are The Anti-Communist Impulse, published by Random House, Trends and Tragedies of American Foreign Policy, Ethnic and Political Attitudes, Democracy for the Few, which I've just mentioned, now in its 5th edition, Inventing Reality, The Politics of the Mass Media, The Sword and the Dollar, Imperialism, Revolution and the Arms Race, Make-Believe Media, which is coming out in 2 weeks, so that's a new one. You probably don't know that title, Make-Believe Media, and The Politics of Entertainment. And of course, he has articles in every single one of our publications of note, The Nation, The Progressive, Political Affairs, American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, and on and on and on. He's appeared on radio and TV talk shows. His lectures have been played on numerous radio stations to enthusiastic audiences. And those of you who are readers of The Nation magazine, as I am from time to time, will know that you can purchase his tapes. They're advertised in The Nation magazine. He's lectured widely on college campuses and before religious, labor, community, and public interest groups around this country and around the world. Those who have read Dr. Parenti's books or heard any of his lectures know also of the radical and forthright nature of his analysis and assessment of United States policy. I'd like to exercise the privilege of the interlocutor, and as I said, quote for you a few words from Dr. Parenti's book, Democracy for the Few. And I thought in preparation or in our activities for tonight's benefit on behalf of the victims of the United States air war against Iraq, that they are very timely and worth sharing. Parenti says in his introductory remarks, and I quote, "This book explores how the American political system operates. American governance, as portrayed in most of our textbooks, bears little resemblance to American government as practiced by the men who rule this country. The central theme of this book is that our government represents the privileged few rather than the needy, that there exists a close relationship between political power and economic wealth. The desire to ignore the relationship between private wealth and public power and confine one's attention to more respectable and safer subjects persists within academic circles today. In this book, we will try to confront that relationship. And one reason that I wanted some public acclaim and applause for each one of you sitting here tonight is that I know of the work of many of you, and I know that, like Dr. Parenti, you haven't shirked to face the burning issues of our time. And indeed, it is more secure, and it is more safe to not publicly face or address them. But I'm happy to be here tonight and to share with you the words of Dr. Michael Parenti as he looks at our time and our day.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for the nice introduction. My thanks to Cynthia Johnson and all the other people who labored so hard to put this evening together. I was going to talk about George Bush. It's a very unpleasant subject, but I thought I'd start with the heart of it all. George Bush, President Bush, has been called inconsistent lately, and I want to disagree with that. He's called inconsistent because people have noted that in his policy toward China, he is very patient. China has a repressive regime. There are no open political parties or open press and all that stuff. And yet Bush says we should not impose a moral litmus test on China. We should have patience. It's a country that's going through changes that may take a long time. So there's a forbearance in regard to China. The inconsistency, some people say, is the prohibitive approach he shows toward Cuba, for instance, where there is a moral litmus test, where demands are made that they must make all the kinds of reforms that he's not demanding on China, all the kinds of guarantees of personal freedom. Although nobody has been killed in Cuba because of their personal views, there are no death squads in Cuba. There are plenty of them in El Salvador. And others have said he's inconsistent because he doesn't make demands on El Salvador, but in fact gives aid to El Salvador. Even that he's been demanding of the Soviet Union, where there's been a wide growth of procedural democracy and dissident opinion and dissident publications. There are more dissident ones than communist ones now. So that the communist ones really are the dissidents practically, and yet there are severe strictures being put on the Soviets. Why this inconsistency? Why this favoritism toward China, and yet why so severe toward the others? Why the favoritism toward El Salvador? I argue there's no inconsistency. There's a hypocrisy in his words and his demands and his postures, but it's very consistent. The one thing that George Bush always is consistent. He's absolutely consistent. And what's consistent about China is that they're opening their doors to private investment, to the multinational corporations on terms that are very favorable to those multinational corporations. They are privatizing their economy. They are dismantling portions of it. They are providing immense markets of cheap labor. So China has a policy that has been very good for multinational corporate investment, for the acquisition of resources, cheap labor, and wealth. The function of capitalism, the essence of capitalism, is to convert nature into commodities and commodities into capital. And China has been cooperating in a way that Cuba hasn't, nor even the Soviet Union as of yet. And it's also the way that El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala cooperate. The goal of U.S. policy is, I would argue, to make the world safe for private corporate capital investment, to make the world safe for that process of capital accumulation, to make the world safe for multinational corporate control of the land, the labor, the resources, and the markets of other countries. To do all that, you need to maintain a global military machine with literally 8 or 900 bases around the world. You need to maintain fleets that travel the oceans and squadrons of bombers that could hit anywhere. Now, it's argued that that isn't what it's about. Bush, and that's where the hypocrisy comes in, Bush argues that, of course, and others like him, that the professed goal is something else. The goal is, well, U.S. national security. We need all these bases because we have a, I'm going to take the Bible off for a second. We need all these bases because we had the threat of the Soviet Union. Well, back in the height of the Cold War, I argued that that was never the threat. To be sure, the Soviet Union was a threat. It represented an alternative social system where the land, labor, and resources were being used in a very different way. It also gave aid to other revolutionary movements. So in that sense, it was a threat. But the Soviet Union as an entity itself was not a threat to the United States as a national security entity. And in fact, now that the Soviet menace is evaporating and the Soviets are moving toward a capitalism, now that the Warsaw Bloc has broken up and the communist countries of Eastern Europe have been replaced for the most part by right-wing capitalist countries that are worshiping the most retrograde components of conservative capitalist society, now that that's happening, the question arises, why do we still need this global military machine? For 40 years we heard it was to keep the Russians away from your sister. And what now? What is the reason now? Well, we also hear that the professed goal is democracy, that we need all these interventions in places because we are supporting democracy. But the record shows that, in fact, we have intervened to overthrow democracies. Goulart in Brazil, Allende in Chile, Arbenz in Guatemala, Sukarno in Indonesia, Mossadegh in Iran, and you can name a number of others, the Greek democracy in the late 60s. And what these different governments had in common, different governments, different leaders, different languages, different cultures, different politics and all, what they all had in common is that they were using political democracy to affect economic democracy. And in affecting economic democracy, they were transmitting some portion of the gross national income away from those who control the wealth of the nation to those who work to create the wealth of the nation. If you look at Allende's Chile, you'll find in the 2 brief, brave years that Allende was in power, the gross national income had shifted some 10% or so away from the people who live off interest and dividends and toward the people who live off wages and salaries. And the goal and the function of Bush's policy is not to defend democracy, but in fact to smash those various democracies when they begin to cut into that system of privilege, power, and wealth and capital accumulation. Whether the country is a communist country, whether it's a Marxist-Leninist country, or a populist nationalist coalition, or just a rather conservative nationalist country like Iraq was, the thing is, when those leaders start using some portion of the wealth of that country to do things, frittering it away, wasting it on things like school books and water treatment facilities and clean drinking water and health clinics for people, when they use the money that way, that's just so much less money that's going to Exxon and Chase Manhattan and Mobil and Chevron and General Dynamics and General Motors and General Electric and all the other generals. That's the question. So the goal is to make the world safe for the people in column A against the people in column B. All of humanity is divided into column A and column B. In column A are those people who live off their investments. They live on dividends. They live on the interest on bonds and securities. They live on rents. They live on land and mineral royalties that they earn. They live on a variety of other things like that, the appreciation on speculative investments and so forth and so on. Column B is made up, which I suspect is heavily overrepresented in this room right now. Column B is made up of the people who live principally you might have a little CD which gets $500 interest, whatever, but it's not enough to live on. We live off wages, salaries, and pensions and things like that. In Democracy for the Few, I have a line where I say, the trick to getting rich is not to work hard, but to get others to work hard for you. And then I got a little snot letter from a student out on the West Coast saying, "Dear Dr. Parenti, on page such and such, and he quotes this. I could see him snickering with his fraternity friends as he wrote the letter and saying, I think that's very good advice as to how to get rich, and I would like to get rich. Do you have any further advice as to how I can exploit others and get them to work hard for me so that I could get rich?" And he signed it. I've decided I'm not going to debate these people anymore. I write serious letters, I give serious responses. But to this letter, his name was Ted something, so I just wrote on it, I said, "Dear Teddy, some asshole sent me this letter and signed your name to it." And I folded it and sent it back to him. Which I don't think is the response he was expecting. But that's a big thing. Now, they don't go out and say, they know you're not going to wave your flag and wrap yourself in yellow ribbons if we say, make the world safe for ITT and Exxon. So they say, we stop aggression, we've got to save democracy, free Kuwait. I thought this was a fascinating phrase, free Kuwait, I was reminded of what Gandhi once said. Remember when Gandhi stood there and saw the Western colonizers come in and plunder and pilfer and impoverish his country? And then they said to him, "Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization?" He said, "It would be a good idea." And I thought, free Kuwait. Free Kuwait. It would be a good idea to get rid of the Amar and all that. But reality shows us something different. There was no fighting for democracy, and the Bill Moyers special just the other night had a clip of Bush saying, we're fighting for democracy, we're fighting for democracy, in that dynamic, powerful way he has of talking, and we're fighting hard for it. There are death squads in Kuwait. There are kangaroo courts. There are people being rounded up, Palestinians, Iraqis, Kuwaitis. The U.S. government to this day and the State Department has not done a thing to get in touch with democratic Kuwaiti forces and representatives of the democratic Kuwaiti forces, has ignored them, has given them no encouragement, which is a dangerous thing to do anyway, as the Kurds learn. So it wasn't to save democracy. It isn't for national security. It is to keep the world safe for the Column A people. And that process, whereby the dominant interests in one country expropriate the land and labor and natural resources and markets of another country, that process has a name. You can never talk about it. You cannot talk about that process, even though it is the most powerful force in the history of the world over the last 500 years. It has shaped the map of the world. It has led to untold numbers of wars and conflicts and murders and atrocities. That process is called imperialism. And that process goes on today just as it went on with the Portuguese in Africa and the French and the Dutch and the Belgians and the British. What these nations did in places like Africa, Latin America, Asia, Ireland, India, what they did in impoverishing these countries. The third world is not underdeveloped. It's overexploited. It's been impoverished and plundered to an incredible degree. The tin, the copper, the bauxite, the manganese, the cotton, the cocoa, the rubber, the oil, the silver, the gold, and the labor, and the slaves, and you can go on the list of things that for 500 years the dominant interests of one country, generally Western European, North America, and much later on Japanese, have done to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That process is still going on today. That process of expropriation. There's very little direct colonization. They no longer own the countries. They just own the economies and control the wealth and much of the infrastructure in these countries. And when a nationalist leader arises, when a leader comes up, be he a Noriega or a Gaddafi or a Saddam Hussein, whatever else he may do, and he may not be a saint, he may have committed any number of crimes of his own, when he has the temerity to begin to interfere with things like the price structure of oil, whatever else, to defend his interests and maximize his income at the expense of the multinationals or at the expense of whatever, it doesn't have to be oil, it could be any other thing, then he must be done away with. Even if it's a little tiny country like Grenada. You could say, oh, wait a minute. Grenada isn't an economic threat to the multinationals. What do you got in Grenada? Just nutmeg, and you can always get that nutmeg from Africa. That's right. But the invasion of Grenada wasn't, and Reagan was right. He said it's not a matter of nutmeg. I said it's the first time I agreed with the guy. It's not for a direct economic interest. It's to serve notice to the people of Grenada that they cannot develop an alternative social order. To serve notice to the people of the Caribbean that if any of you try this, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get the 102nd Airborne on your neck. That stuff, that the labor in your country and the resources of your country and the markets of your country belong to us. You get the hole in the ground, you get the pollution, you get the shanty towns, you get the disease, you get the typhoid and the contaminated water systems, you get the bloated kids, you get the starving people, you get the underemployment, but we skim the cream. And if you try to tamper with that, you will get it. In 1954, when Mossadegh was overthrown after he had nationalized the oil of Iran, he was overthrown by the CIA, which was led, the whole CIA project in Iran was led by a man named Kermit Roosevelt, who, after the overthrow of Mossadegh, Kermit Roosevelt was then given as his reward a six-figure salary, 1954, with Gulf Oil Company. That was his reward. And at that time in 1954, the New York Times ran an editorial and said, let this serve notice to other nations who get too extreme-minded that the resources and the investments of responsible elements of the world shall be protected. So I don't have the exact quote. I'm sorry, I should have brought it with me. It says it very explicitly, that if you tamper, that oil in your ground belongs to us, and if you touch it, we'll kill you. It's a kind of a national security mafia approach to things. What kind of governments do we want? Not socialist governments, not national self-development governments, not populist reformist governments, not governments of that kind. We want governments, or not we, I mean the ruling interests in this country want governments that are defined as client-state government. A client-state government is a government that's ruled by a comprador class. A comprador class is a class who defines its interests totally as being totally coterminous with the foreign investors. The Al-Sabah family in Kuwait, the Saudi family in Saudi Arabia, who literally expropriate. No, in fact, they named the country after them. The country used to be called Arabia, remember? Lawrence of Arabia and Arabian Nights and all that. It's now Saudi Arabia. It's named after the family. They have literally hundreds of billions of dollars. Actually, a couple of $1 trillion, those two families have the equivalent of a couple of trillions of dollars invested in U.S. banks, U.S. corporations, U.S. real estate, and U.S. Treasury notes. That's the kind of family they want. That's the kind of ruling class. They want a client state. They don't want a Colonel Nasser in Egypt who nationalizes the Suez Canal and takes the earnings of it to give the Egyptian masses free public education. For the first time in 3,000 years of history, free public education. They don't want him. And John Foster Dulles gets up and says President Nasser is the Hitler of the Nile. Remember that one? Hitler of the Nile. They don't want a Gaddafi who comes in Libya and nationalizes the oil and takes the earnings and investments of it and builds reclamations, plants 40 million trees and puts in healthcare systems and redistributes income to the mass of the people, education, all that sort of thing. Gaddafi, a Hitler madman. That's the thing they don't want. They want a client state. They want leaders who say, come on in, here it is, it's all yours, take what you want out of it. You get any name the terms you want. There's no occupational safety laws. There's no environmental protection laws you have to worry about. There's no minimum wage. There's no child labor laws. Hire whoever you want. Just make sure you give me my cut, and if they get out of line, if they try to organize and all that, we'll come down on them with our civil guard or our death squads who are trained and financed by your people. Thank you. Well, we got a good little thing going here. That's the client state. And at home, you get the same kind of class war. You may not think so, but look at the last Bush budget. Increased spending for the National Security State, Environmental Protection Agency, frozen at last year's level. Federal retirement programs cut $3 billion. Medicare, this is Bush's proposals, cut $5.5 billion. Children's nutrition cut $400 million. $400 million cut from the children's nutrition, from the WIC program, Women, Infant, Children. While Peter Jennings the other night, a little flash, a little flicker every so often. I remember what C. Wright Mills once said, that in the face of such control and such propaganda and such deception, a simple fact sometimes seems like a radical thrust. And Peter Jennings said, there are 12 million children who live in extreme want in America. Many, if not most, don't get enough to eat. By the end of the month, the cupboard is bare, and they must go hungry. Well, children's nutrition cut $400 million. $400 million! What the Pentagon spends in 12 hours was cut. Funds for clean water treatment facilities cut 18%. Mass transit funding cut almost 20%. This is Bush's proposal. This is what he's offering the country here. That's taking away from the people in column B so that it can be spent for the people in column A. We hear from conservatives that the public sector spending just takes us down the slippery slope of socialism. But that's not entirely true, by the way. But by the way, this welfare spending on welfare, the total welfare budget last year was $8.8 billion. That's less than 1% of the budget. That's what was spent on the people below the poverty level. And besides, they do go in for socialism of another kind, a socialism for the rich. There's socialism for the diseconomies of capitalism. For years, I remember I used to hear about the poverty of Appalachia, the forgotten people of Appalachia. Appalachia was the shame of the nation. We must have a war on poverty. And I wondered, well, isn't that interesting? Who made Appalachia so poor? Appalachia, like Indonesia, like Chile, like Bolivia, like Iran and Iraq. Appalachia is a rich country. It's not poor. It had something very rich. It was called gold. It was called black gold, or coal, as we know it. Coal, the nickname for coal back in the late 1900s was black gold. Appalachia was rich. Ask the Rockefellers and the Mellons and the Morgans. They made a mint out of Appalachia. Only the people are poor. Now, how did that happen? They plundered the area, exploited the people, and leave them. And when we see the poverty, then the problem is socialized. The public will have to pay. And I wondered, why don't the multinational corporations who did all that, why don't they pay? Socialism for environmental devastation. We hear it again. We see CEOs get up there, corporation heads, and say, well, if the public wants to clean up the pollution, it's okay, but the public's going to have to pay for it. We can't do it. We're not big enough. They're just big enough to create the pollution. They're not big enough to pay for it. So they get socialist. Public spending. Let the public do it. The diseconomies are always put on the public. They privatize prosperous industries. They privatize efficient money-making industries. And they put onto the public the ones that are failing and have been milked. That's what they did with the whole railroad system. They made it socialist. After the railroad profiteers had plundered and whatever else, they built Amtrak and all the other things, Conrail, and subsidized it with hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. funds, billions of dollars in U.S. funds, and now that it's running and it's working again, they're privatizing, they're re-privatizing it and giving it back to the rich. So there's a lot of socialism. There's socialism from Jesse Helms, the little fascist senator from North Carolina. You know Jesse Helms. Tobacco subsidies. One of the most heavily subsidized products in America is tobacco. And Jesse Helms gets up on the Senate floor and he says, this is not a matter of a subsidy. These are human beings we're talking about. Human beings. You see? Unlike food stamps, which of course don't involve human beings. Those are just little pieces of paper, which he cuts and fights and opposes. But subsidies for the big farmers, no socialistic handouts for hungry infants, but for the tobacco industry, okay. For the electronics industry, okay. For the telecommunication industry, okay. For the defense industry, where 70% of the research and development the equity is provided by the Pentagon itself, okay. That's all socialism. Socialism for medical schools. Every doctor in America, including the right-wing Neanderthal ones who oppose anything that might cut into their incomes, like socialized medicine, every doctor in America is subsidized. There's no one who goes through medical school, even if he pays full tuition, who is paying the real full cost of that medical education. There are federal funding of all kinds involved in construction, in plant, and research, and so forth and so on. Funding that's given by tax-paying poor who then cannot even afford to go see the doctors whose taxes have helped get those guys through college. Taxes from millions of working poor. There's even socialism to finance the transition from socialism to capitalism in Eastern Europe. The U.S. Enterprise Fund that was put up, that was taken from the public funds, from the taxpayers of America to help subsidize the privatization of industries in Eastern Europe. So conservatives say they're against government. They say government can't solve the problems. It is the problem. But that's only in the area of human services. That's only in the areas where that might come and cut in on their prerogatives and their powers. They want lots of government when it's the FBI, when it's police state surveillance, when it's militarism and the like. They preach the gospel of free market. But you see, the truth of the matter is, we tried all that. Everything they talk about today, what we need is no regulations. What we need is a free market really operating. First of all, let's make two things clear. One is there's never been in history any society that's run purely on free market standards. There always have to be regulations and protections of some kind. If you really did pure laissez-faire capitalism, you would tear the society apart. But we had a very close approximation to it. We've done that. And the right that keeps arguing and fighting to get back to it, forget that we had it. It was called 1890. And 1890 gave us child labor. It gave us typhoid in our cities, typhoid epidemics in Philadelphia, Chicago. It gave us contaminated food. It gave us widespread poverty and unemployment. It gave us environmental devastation. It gave us no pensions or minimum wage protections. It gave us regressive tax systems. And that's the model that they're trying to move back to. The goal of right-wing conservatism, conservative capitalism in this country is the third world. It's a third world goal. It's a goal where labor unions will be broken. It's a goal where the capital accumulation process will be increased. It's a goal where capitalism will work better and more successfully. Remember that. We often say capitalism is successful. Look at Austria, or look at West Germany, or look at the Benelux countries, or look at Sweden or whatever else, or the US or Canada. But those are countries where capitalism isn't working all that successfully. As a social order, it's less oppressed and less miserable. But if you want to see where capitalism really works successfully, you've got to go to Guatemala. You've got to go to Indonesia. You've got to go to the Philippines. And that's where you'll see it working. Just as I said, the client state, where the rate of accumulation is 200% and 300% higher than it is in a country like Sweden, where 80% of the people are in unions and there's a whole health system, and they cut in on profits and they tax the rich heavily and all that sort of thing. So capitalism is most successful where it is doing the thing it is meant to do, which is to accumulate, to amass wealth in order to invest, to amass still more wealth. And that rate of accumulation is much higher in the third world, where you have something close to the free market ideal. I say to students who argue for the free market, I say, would you get on an airliner that is run purely on a free market system? How would you do that? Would you fly on an airline that's run free market? I said, first of all, where would you land? All the airports are socialist. You say, what? They're a little shocked. Yes, all the airports are publicly owned, publicly regulated, with air traffic controls and all that. How else could it work? A purely free market airline, wouldn't that be something? You'd have more choice. You could fly maintenance or non-maintenance. You could see United going, yeah, I'll get in ahead of Delta. We'll get there first, folks. Would you really want that sort of crazy thing? The Gulf War was part of that mythology. I think it was part of looking for new adversaries, creating new adversaries now that there's a shortage of old ones, so as to justify the keeping of this global military machine. And it was also to serve notice to everybody in the Middle East that we call the tune on how your country is going to be run. And if you have the audacity to oppose us, this is what's going to happen to you. In short, I'd say the Gulf War had three major functions. It had a number of others too. One was to keep the open door for capital accumulation. Two was to maintain and magnify the military-industrial complex. And three, to keep the global military machine intact and give reasons for it. That war has taught this country the wrong lessons, that if there can be a one-sided slaughter, then it's just. That we can rejoice over our high-tech weapons of mass destruction. This whole idea that Bush should be applauded because the policy was successful, the resolution in Congress, we support our president, who unerringly, the phrasing of it was, I mean, it's, you know, that's what they used to do in Nuremberg for Hitler, unerringly, who unerringly brought us to victory, as if the success of the policy was its own justification. I mean, Hitler took Poland in 2 weeks. Does that mean it was a brilliant, successful campaign? Does that mean it's a policy we support? And even if you didn't like Saddam Hussein, and even if you thought he should get out, is that what you do? Murder his people in large numbers? I mean, I hate the government of Guatemala, and I hate the government of El Salvador. But if someone said to me, okay, what we're going to do is carpet bomb Guatemala City and carpet bomb San Salvador and kill 20 or 30,000 people, and we'll dislodge the government, I would oppose that with full vigor, because it's not to make war against the people. If you really want to help in El Salvador, what you do is cut off the murderous aid to that army in El Salvador and give direct aid to the democratic forces of El Salvador. And that would be the way to help it. And so this idea, this idea that you demonize the leader and the leader is associated with his people, then gives you license to destroy the people. And if you can do that without losing too many of your own, then you've won a really great victory. This is the kind of thing we've got to continue to argue against and educate against. Now, a lot of the American people weren't that vicious, and they weren't that Neanderthal, although they seemed it. The polls show, the surveys done, many people showed that the more they watched television, the more misinformed they were. The more they believed that Saddam Hussein was going to invade Saudi Arabia, the more they believed that the oil supply wouldn't be coming to America. I mean, they had a whole bunch of misapprehensions. The less they knew about Kuwait's slant drilling of the Rumaila oil fields, the less they knew about any number of other things. Another function that the war had was to activate the popularity of the leader. Alexander Hamilton, in his Federalist Paper number 6, argues that many leaders throughout history have, and he wrote this in September of 1789, many leaders have pursued foreign adventures in order to win popularity at home. And if you remember that in July of 1990, George Bush's popularity had dropped 20 points. The S&L scandal was up. The state of the economy was up. Now the air conditioning is back on. I'm going to just put this. Excuse me. I've been writing a book on how the U.S. got into the Spanish-American War. And I found some stunning parallels. If you ask everybody, they all give you the same line. Well, we got into that war in 1898, where the U.S. went in, if the average American is as illiterate about history as the kids coming out of school today. Let me just give you a little background. In 1898, the U.S. told Spain to get out of Cuba and started a war with Spain, when Spain was willing to negotiate everything to not have war, to give every concession to the U.S., even give autonomy to Cuba. just to save face. The U.S. pushed and pushed and pushed a war which Spain did not want to fight and was willing to give on everything. And the first battle was not fought in Cuba to save and liberate the brave Cuban people. It was fought in the Philippines to take the Philippines, and then Guam and Puerto Rico, and then Cuba. And at that time, you had a very interesting thing. The story given out all the time is that it was William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer who, with their yellow press, sensationalist press, went out there and whipped up a hysteria among the people, and the people forced a willing and unwilling President McKinley into fighting Spain. Well, I found studies in the U.S. Navy Department written in June of 1896, 2 years before the hysteria was supposed to reach its peak. Written in fact, by a man who was chief of naval operations and later became executive officer of the battleship Maine that went to the harbor in Maine, which called and designated the scenario as to how the war with Cuba, how the war with Spain would come. We would make these demands, we would then send troops to the Philippines, we would then make contact with insurgents and so forth, step by step by step, which is exactly what McKinley did. And I discovered something else, that the people of the United States were not clamoring for war in the 1890s, that in fact all through from 1893 on, they were clamoring for something else, which was jobs and bread. There had been a devastating depression. There was Coxey's army marching on Washington, millions of unemployed and desperate poor marching through towns and villages and winning the cheers of the people as they passed, many of whom joined them. There were farmers fighting pitched battles against the railroad cartels. There were massive strikes going on. There was child labor. There was all sorts of misery. There was strife of all kinds. And there were any number of people, a Virginia senator who said, what this country needs is a good war to take its mind off all these festering problems. One shot across the bow of a Spanish ship will knock the pus out of the anarchistic, socialistic, populistic boil that defaces our political surface. That's almost a near quote. And repeated quotes like that. Fitzhugh Lee, who was the U.S. consul in Havana, writing to President McKinley and saying, what we need is a war to take the American people's minds off their imaginary ills. Their imaginary ills. Fitzhugh Lee, the Dan Quayle of his day. Fitzhugh Lee, a member of the Southern aristocracy, a former Confederate general, a former slaveholder, the nephew of Robert E. Lee. For that guy, that child labor and poverty and misery, they were the American imaginary ills, you see. And then I came across a populist by the name of Tom Watson, a Georgia populist who led challenges against both the Republican and Democratic parties, and in fact got elected governor, and in fact got elected senator once. And when the Spanish War came, he said, the Spanish War finished us. The blare of the bugle drowned the voice of the reformer. That in fact, once the war begins, you don't necessarily turn opinion that way, but you monopolize opinion visibility, and you hype it up in that sense. And the people who are for the war come forward with ever renewed vigor. And many of the other people are concerned about the welfare of the troops and all that, and they too, that peculiar definition of patriotism which equates it with murder and militarism, they too come forward. But Watson had this to say as that war was going on, and that this is 100 years ago in 1898. He wrote as follows: who gets the benefit of the war? The bond seekers, the capitalists, the railroads. National bankers will profit by this war. The new bonds give them the basis for new banks, and their power is prolonged. The privileged classes all profit by this war. It takes the attention of the people off economic issues and perpetuates the unjust system they have put upon us. Politicians profit by the war. It buries issues they dare not meet. What do the people get out of this war? The fighting and the taxes. Watson goes on. What is the United States doing in this war with Spain in the first place? True, Spain is oppressing Cuba, but so is England oppressing Ireland, Egypt, and India. France is oppressing Siam and Madagascar. Turkey is oppressing Armenia. Should we then take up arms against the oppressors of the world? we would more likely end by becoming oppressors ourselves. The Spaniards and Cubans were bushwhacking one another and killing from 3 to 5 men at a battle. We have gone down there and killed more people in 3 months than they would have killed in 13 years. If they were starving before, who feeds them now? What are we going to get out of this war as a nation? Endless troubles, complications, expense? Republics cannot go into the conquering business and remain republics. Militarism leads to military domination, military despotism. Imperialism smooths the way for the emperor. And as we know, in every president, right, there's an emperor that's just dying to get out. That was me, not Watson, who said that last part. Well, George Santayana, years ago, said, and it's always quoted like it's biblical, and it's the unvarnished truth. He said that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't believe it in regard to our leaders. If they keep repeating history, it's not because they haven't learned the lessons, it's because they learned all too well. If the imperialists of today resemble the imperialists of yesterday in their violence and their hypocrisy and their murder and their ruthlessness, it's not because they didn't know about the other cases, it's because they learned what works and what they have to do to defend the people in column A. What we have to do, if you feel discouraged about it, if you feel defeated and all those things, feel that. It's okay. Feel discouraged, feel disgusted, feel defeated. Feel that for a while, and then get back up and start fighting again. It's not because it's a good idea. It's not because it would make a better world. It's because we have to. It's out of necessity. It's for our survival. It's for the survival of real democracy, which they are nibbling away at and cutting back at with all sorts of repressive laws. And it's for the very survival of the earth itself. I have a friend who had a neck problem. He went to an acupuncturist, and the Chinese acupuncturist put a needle in his wrist and put one in his leg. And he said, wait a minute, I don't get the connection. I got a neck, my neck is hurting me, and you're putting a needle in my arm and in my leg. What's the connection? And the Chinese acupuncturist said, whole body connected, take a look. You know, that typical Chinese gentle contempt for the Westerners' idiocy, you know. And so what we got to say, whole society connected, take a look. Whole universe connected, take a look. It's our universe, and we've got to fight to keep it. Thank you. Yes, will we have some questions? Is that okay? Yeah.
What do you think about the theory that 18 months before the Persian Gulf War, there was a group that met at Langley, and I can't prove this, but I heard from the intelligence community that they found a title, and it went something like this: "Strategy to take advantage of the hostility between Kuwait and Iraq," and that the kinds of evidence, like the ambassador's interview with Saddam Hussein, that showed a pattern of planning to plan the whole war, and then after the invasion to keep any negotiations from stopping the war. What do you feel about the likelihood that that was accurate?
Oh, I think it's absolutely possible that you have to create casus belli. That is, you have to create reasons for war. And if you want to take out somebody who's giving you trouble, you then have to provoke those people into a situation that you say is a threat. And that's been done again and again. In Grenada, there suddenly was the manufactured casus belli of the endangered medical students, even though the head of the medical school came on and said they're not in any danger at all, to justify the invasion, and also the disruption that went on in the government itself was used as an opportunity. And in Panama, it was the killing of those two officers who deliberately went through this blockade right in front of the military headquarters, which was very well lit. There's no way they could have made a mistake on that, and a couple of other things like that. So you always create incidents. I have a quote from the Mexican foreign minister, 1843, to the Mexican Congress, talking about how the Americans have no shortage of incidents which they can always create and find to then make incursions and to push us into wars that we don't want, because we know we're going to lose them and we're going to lose everything thereafter, which happened a couple of years later, right? 40% of Mexico was taken, which is now part of the United States. The Mexicans haven't forgot it. Most Americans never heard of it. But I have no doubt that he was set up, that they were planning this. Not that the plan was inevitable, that they had this as an option among others, and that at a certain point that became the workable plan, the thing to do. After they used him against Iran to use Arab nationalism against an Islamic fundamentalism, both of which give you trouble, you see, because both of them make claims on the land, labor markets, and all that. After he was used against Iran, then he became troublesome too. As early as February of 1990, Saddam Hussein made a speech where he talked about the economic war that was being waged against Iraq by the West, that the OPEC price standards were being undercut, that it was costing Iraq billions, that Kuwait was stealing billions in oil. Kuwait would not even allow air flight rights for Iraqi airlines to Basra, to make Basra an international city. I mean, there were all sorts of provocations that were going on. The creeping border going north, that border kept new settlements and all drifting north, you know, when the Iraqis had wanted to negotiate that border with the Kuwaitis told them to kiss off. So there was a very unusual behavior. I mean, normally Belgium doesn't act that way toward Germany, you know. Grenada doesn't act that way toward the U.S. Panama didn't act that way. It's rather odd to suddenly see little Kuwait telling the Iraqis to kiss off. If you don't like it, you can lump it. And it was very clear that they must have gotten signs from the Americans on that. Or they're just aberrant, odd things, you know. The thing about all these odd things is how they keep happening again and again in the same direction with the same interests. And you see, one of the goals of news people is to not show you those generalizable patterns, but to always dwell on the particularities and the idiosyncratic things. I saw an interview of Scotty Reston on PBS. You know who Scotty Reston is? Oh, in Washington years ago, everybody used to talk about Scotty. James Reston, the columnist. He had a column in the New York Times for 50 years. Everybody used to talk about Scotty, like they just had lunch with him yesterday. Oh, Scotty said this, and Scotty that. Well, Scotty was on PBS. And I stopped to listen to the show for a little while because I wanted to find out what it is he had learned in 50 years. And it didn't take me long to listen. It wasn't all that much, but I could see why he was able to keep a column for 50 years in the New York Times. He was saying, well, Harry Truman was this kind of a guy, and he was a funny guy, and he did some things like that, and this is that, and it was all the idiosyncratic, the particularities, and all that, talking about the idiosyncratic particularities and differences between Ronald Reagan and George Bush. You get into that, rather than looking at the awful similarities, you see, which are big and repeatable. Why do those things keep happening that way? And you look and say, well, Bush is more of a guy who runs his show in this way, and you know, it's very complex. They're complex guys. They are complex guys. And I'm sitting there saying, you're not complex, Scotty.
Yes, ma'am. Where is George Bush vulnerable? Is he
Where's Bush
vulnerable?
what?
Is he vulnerable in relation to the hostages in Iran that didn't get out until?
But the story's done.
what
The
is it?
story's been dropped, right?
Or-
the October surprise story.
Where is he vulnerable?
Is it in the mainstream media?
It'll be on Koppel, I think, tonight, isn't it?
Oh, great. Well, good. Every so often it comes up again, I guess. Well, Koppel, though, God knows what he'll do with it. So they play with a stacked deck. They have 4 people on, and one of them may be, sick will be on, let's say, and then they have these 3 other guys. One would say, and how, and the other one says, hey, he's crazy. And they did that with the KAL 007. They had one guy on who said that plane was flying where it shouldn't be, when the perfect arch, and everybody else was saying, those Russians were inhuman, shooting this poor little helpless airliner down. That's how Koppel does it. But, well, that's good that it is on. I think Bush may be vulnerable on the economy. That is, a lot of people are hurting, and he's showing himself quite oblivious to the needs of people. The trouble is, you have a Democratic Party that's a class collaborationist party, and that means that it can go so far in its opposition. And it can change the government, but it mustn't destabilize the state, you see. You've got to distinguish between government and state. The government is the issues and the policies and the elections and all that, and the state is that irreducible part that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. The state is the executive. The state is the thing that does it. And our national security state is increasingly outside of the realm of government. I mean, they're not absolutely distinct and apart. I mean, actually, they interpermeate. But those functions are very real, and they are different. Allende, for instance, was elected to the government of Chile. He was never quite able to get hold of the state power. The state power is the army, the police, the military, you see. The people who enforce which direction it's going to go. And that Congress, when it gets close to destabilizing, as it had the chance in Iran-Contra, they would get up and tell you, not in my vocabulary, but in their own, they say, this country, you heard Democrats saying, this country needs a successful presidency. We need that. They're worried about destabilizing it. And I'm saying, why do we need a successful presidency? One, what's your definition of success? And I thought your commitment is not to stabilizing that portion of the state, regardless of what it does, even if it shreds the Constitution. Your commitment was to justice and truth, which is ultimately the best stabilization. But it is very destabilizing, of course, because that kind of truth can really erode the support that people are supposed to have for their institutions. Cynthia, you're standing there. Is there something you want to do before we go on?
Let me just interrupt for a moment, and first of all, thank you so much for donating your time tonight, because I know that, I really do feel that this is the most important thing we can be doing as U.S. citizens, which is dealing with the truth, that if we believe there is any spirit and possibility of democracy in this government, that this is what we need to be doing, and also dealing with the country that we've destroyed. There is an unimaginable medical tragedy happening in Iraq, as you may know. Even in the Washington Post today, it refers to the children melting. My name is Cynthia Johnson. I'm with Women Strike for Peace, and as Lynn mentioned, we're a group that started in our concern for children. And when we see what is thank you. And when we see what is happening in Iraq, an independent Harvard study, which was there in April, and we have it in the back, says that conservatively, and this is said in the Washington Post here today, 170,000 children under the age of 1 may die in these next months because of the infrastructure being destroyed by our bombing and the ongoing sanctions. The point is that Iraq had a health system, as the Harvard study shows, which reached 90% of the people. Now, I wish we could say this in this country. I don't have health insurance. 40 million people in this country have no health insurance. But anyway, that is the issue of militarism, and it is the issue that Dr. Parenti addressed tonight, and the fact that if we have the truth, we can change this around. So I want to commend some of the information in the back. Read this Washington Post article. And I want to thank you for your generosity tonight. We have, I think we've raised over $300 for the two international groups that we are supporting tonight. The Gulf Peace Team, I'm going to hand out some information about the Gulf Peace Team. They have been a presence in the Middle East for the last months, and they're also this very day delivering on June 20th. They're delivering on June 20th, the Gulf Peace Team will be escorting a convoy comprised of $260,000 worth of medicines, oral rehydration solution, and infant formula. And they're delivering another one on June 26th. So some of the money that you've so generously given tonight will go to the Gulf Peace Team. I'm going to hand out information about them. And also another very wonderful voluntary international group called AMERT. And I'm going to call one of their volunteers, Nada Kader, a recent graduate of Georgetown who's a full-time volunteer for that organization, to tell you a little bit about what they do all over the world with man-made and natural disasters and what they're doing in Iraq. And she has some photos that I would like you to look at as well. And again, I thank you for your generosity, and I'm going to pass this around again if anyone missed and anything else you can give. This all goes directly to medical aid.
Yeah, hello. I just want to briefly explain what we're doing in Iraq. It's very difficult for us to work there because of this embargo against the country. We're not working for any government. AMERT is a non-profit, non-government, tax-exempt international relief agency working in more than 100 nations across the globe. We have committed ourselves to reconstructing 2 hospitals that were destroyed, one in Karbala and one in Basra. And we're also rebuilding an orphanage. We're actually building an orphanage for 2,500 orphans. There are tens of thousands of Iraqi children without parents today. The condition is really critical, and as you can see from the photos, a lot of the babies have swollen bellies, which is something that is looking like Ethiopia. The dehydration is terrible. There's a chronic lack of safe drinking water there, and it's very difficult for us to bring water purification technology into the country. We have to basically get it in from Jordan, through Europe to Jordan, and Jordan into Iraq. So we appreciate very much your contributions this evening. Another thing I would like to announce is June 28th, we have a benefit dinner, a vegetarian benefit dinner at the First Congregational Church in Washington, D.C. We would really appreciate your support there. Basically, AMERT is funded by private donors completely. We are not affiliated with any government. In fact, we started in 1965 in India, and it makes us unique because we're one of the very few third world-based relief agencies. Most of the relief agencies have started in the West, and actually many of them have Western motives. They're coming into the nation with ulterior motives. So when we do relief work, we do not want to have any ulterior motive. We want to just go in there and help the people, give them clean drinking water, try to help rebuild the country. So we very much appreciate any and all of your support. And if anyone would like to help us selling tickets for the vegetarian benefit dinner, you can also talk to me after. Yeah.
Who the person is whom the organization is named after?
AMERT stands for Ananda Marga Universal Relief Team, and the founder of Ananda Marga is P.R. Sarkar. He died last year in India in October in 1990. He's quite well known in India, and he's slowly getting to be well known in the West. He's written several books, not only on relief, but also on development. He's also come up with an alternative to capitalism and communism. It's called PROUT, Progressive Utilization Theory. And I think in the coming years, we are going to see, as capitalism starts to break down, and as there are more and more crises facing our globe, our planet, I think a lot of people are going to look for alternatives. We are rational human beings. We can come up with a socioeconomic system that is just, that is fair, that does not exploit human beings. We can come up with a socioeconomic system that meets the basic needs of humanity: food, shelter, clothing, education, medical care. So basically, it's, it's quite comprehensive. In the long term, we see ourselves as humanistic revolutionaries who would like to bring change. Because we understand, we're working in a capitalistic structure, and there's only so much relief you can do. Really, the long term, we want to change the global economic structure and system.
There was a very good, you had something more? Yeah, I'll take a few more. While let me do a commercial of my own. People's Video of Seattle, Washington distributes my audio and videotapes. Nobody makes a penny on it, not them, not me. And flyers are on the tables back there. Also, you can order books of mine from, I think it's International Bookstores, the Long Beach one, if you can't get it at Common Concerns. My publisher specializes in rare books, so he tries to keep my books as inaccessible as possible. But International will send you any one of the 4 or 5 volumes they have if you want to get a book. If you're down to your last $5 and you got to choose between an audio tape or contributing it to Amherst to help rebuild the hospital, contribute it to Amherst, and I'll give you another lecture some other time. Yes.
I want to ask you a question and then also make an announcement, if you don't mind. The question is, what do you see happening in the north of Iraq, in northern Iraq, Kurdistan, Turkey, etc., etc.? All that question, is it possible that the allies, the so-called allies, do want to keep North Iraq and Kirkuk, the oil, forever? And please, if you want to take, there is a Mesopotamian Cultural Society here, based in Arlington, and the phone number is 703-524-0600. You can come and ask me again. And
what society? I didn't hear
Mesopotamian Society. Mesopotamia. Oh,
Mesopotamia
sorry.
Society.
Sumeria, Mesopotamia. The name is Mesopotamian Cultural Society.
Mesopotamia, I know.
The thing is that they are having, I'm a member, and they send me an invitation. They are having a function or a celebration or an event in the Cannon Building, beginning July. I'm sorry, I don't have, call them, because you are all invited, in the Cannon Building, in the hall, I think, of the Cannon Building. I believe on 1st of July, I'm not sure now, I forgot to bring it with me. So if you call, again, this number, ask me for the number after if you don't get it. The 703-524-0600. It's in Arlington.
You could fix it up with her afterwards. Okay. Thanks.
And so,
anybody else have a question? I don't know what to say about the Kurds. The northern. I think it's all a big hypocrisy, as we all know, that the Kurds are just another pawn in all of this. When they suddenly seem like a destabilizing factor, they will be abandoned, as they were the last time. The media's coverage of the Kurds, of course, is very thorough because it shows a suffering that has been caused supposedly by the Iraqi forces, whereas the media's coverage of the other 14 million people living in Iraq, not those 4 million, not to make light of what they're suffering, but the other 14 million has been criminally negligent and par for the course. That's all I'd say about that issue. There was a very good interview. That trashy little handout we suffer in this city called City Paper, which has gone from mediocre to bad, every so often still has a good thing in it. A couple of weeks ago, it had a very good interview, with the woman who, and her name escapes me, Louise Kaker, right, in which she made an excellent point where the questioner said, what do you think of the U.S. military's insistence that they did not bomb indiscriminately, but that they bombed surgically and they only hit specific targets, with intelligent bombs and all that. And she said, oh, absolutely true. Of course, that's exactly what they did. They bombed surgically. They took out the water treatment plants, they took out the electricity, they took out all the life support systems for the entire population, and now large numbers of people are dying, which, by the way, is a war crime. Remember, they kept showing you those pilots who were captured. Here were guys who've been delivering death, and they had a shiner. Every one of them had a shiner. Somebody belted them. It's always in the left eye. If you're right-handed, you hit somebody. I used to box, I remember, and you get the shiner in the left eye. And this was a war crime because these pilots had been roughed up. What they didn't tell you is that the pilots who had been engaged in war crimes, it's a violation of the Geneva Convention to bomb civilian life support facilities. And that's exactly what's been done. Yes?
This is a little change of the subject, but your title, Hypocrisy of Bush, I have learned about some of the plans for education by our president being the education president. And they want to privatize our public school system, and they point to how much more efficiently business can run the schools. And I think it's worthwhile pointing to the big educational system that business is running already, which is television, and to see just what kind of moral principles we will be encouraging in students, because although the commercials are very bright and cute, the substance is violence and sex, and it's not what I think our public school system should be.
Well, I just wrote a book on that subject. It'll be out in 2 weeks, called Make-Believe Media, The Politics of Entertainment, and it deals with the images and themes and values of Hollywood films and television programs. And yeah, it's true. The violence is incredible. The militarism, the story after story, movie after movie, where there's no human personalities, there's no democracy, there's no human interrelation. There's just domination, clash, conflicts resolved by applications of violence and counter-violence. It's really quite something. And the sex. That Madonna. Have you seen the Madonna tape? It was so horrible. I watched it twice. But let's see. Next question. Anybody? Let's make this the last one. Yeah.
I don't know if you're in the prognostication business, but what would you see happening that changes the system?
Well, what do I say? This is one of those, what do you call what will you see happening to change the system? What do you call the globe that the person looks into? Crystal ball. I always trip up on these technical terms. That's one of those crystal ball questions, and I don't know. I'm telling you the trend I see, which is toward a third world model that the U.S. is moving, privatization of education. There's nothing they're going to leave alone. Don't think once they get theirs, they won't want yours. They want more and more. There's nothing they will leave alone. If they had their way, you would be working 14-hour days for 80 cents an hour. If they had their way. It's the dynamic of the system. That's the way it is. It has certain contradictions in it which have to do with wages. That is, wages which cut into profits have to be kept down. The less I pay you, the more profits I get. But wages which are the source of demand have to be kept up. Ideally, what I want to do as a boss is pay my workers as little as possible and have other bosses pay their workers more, so those workers will have the money to buy the goods and services that my workers produce. However, the other bosses have the same ideas. So what you get is a chronic tendency toward recession. Marx wrote about all this 130 years ago. Marx, the guy they say is irrelevant and doesn't say anything. Marx has great insights into capitalism and imperialism. That's what he was talking about. He didn't know much about socialism. I mean, it hadn't come around yet. But that tendency toward recession, and he said recessions occur when workers are not paid back enough money to buy back the goods and services that their labor produces. And So I see a constant war against labor, a constant war against the environment, really regressive forces acting. You have a court that now allied with the administrative agencies. The courts are now deciding that the conservative executive can reinterpret congressional laws and that the interpretation of the agency shall stand as supreme over congressional interpretation. And if Congress doesn't like that interpretation, it could pass another law. But Congress now would have to pass what? A veto-proof law. And so that's what the Rust versus Sullivan. One thing that was left out of the Rust versus Sullivan, the one that just cut federal funding for clinics that gave advice on abortion, is that there's nothing in that law where Congress says that none of this money can go to any clinic that that recommends, that suggests or informs, doesn't recommend or advocate, but informs a patient of the abortion option. Congress, that's not in the law. That's the executive imposing that interpretation, and the court deciding, yes, they have a right to, and supporting that. Now, if Congress doesn't like that interpretation, they can be more explicit in the next law and say funding can support those things. But now they've got to face the federal veto. Now they've got to get 2/3 of the vote in Congress, which is very hard to do on most of these laws. So a lot of the gains that have been made over the last 40 years are being underwritten. If the agency happens to if the agency happens to pass a liberal decision or interpretation, then the court will overrule it just directly and say, that's really not the interpretation. Then the court's interpretation stands, and they say, if Congress doesn't like that, they could try to pass it. And you got the same dynamic with the rigged veto. So Congress is really getting hamstrung in. It's one of the, see, Congress has become a bit of a problem because for the first time in its history, the powerful committee chairmanships are going to liberals in some substantial numbers, including members of the Congressional Black Caucus and others, people like John Conyers and the like. So they're being hamstrung. I believe that the model is to get America toward being a third world country. Now you could say, yeah, well then who's going to buy the goods? But they don't think that way. The system thinks of how good it is. I mean, no company thinks or worries about the whole system. They worry about their bottom line and their own accumulation process. And that's the kind of thing that Bush is pushing. I think we're going to see some very tough and very terrible times ahead unless people really wake up and get a chance to really think in a more informed way about what are the conditions of their lives and the forces that face them. And that's what I dedicate my life to trying to do against real odds. As you know, they don't put me on Nightline or give me a Sunday afternoon station, or people like me, they don't. They gave Jesse Jackson one, he's off the air now, but he was on at real prime hours like 6 in the morning on Sunday and such. In Seattle, and they changed this time about 3 times in Seattle in a month. What?
What about the institutions where you say you're a teacher? Do you get harassed or silenced there? I mean, usually they do make people who speak the truth, so they make them into clowns, like Al Sharpton is supposed to be this big joke, and anybody who does speak out, or Jesse Jackson, and any teachers that I had in college who were speaking out like this, and they were always made into clowns, or if they were taken seriously, they were removed, and we weren't able to have the opportunity to hear what they had to say.
What school was that?
Well, I'm asking you.
It could have been in a number of schools. Well, there's been a lot of purging in the universities of people.
Teacher,
And my personal experience as a teacher has been one of unmitigated oppression in the sense of losing jobs and being denied jobs, being turned down by departments where I outpublished the whole department. You know, the rule was publish or perish, and if you publish, you're rewarded with appointments in advance. I outpublished, I mean, not every individual in the department, I outpublished the whole department. If you add up all their publications put together, I have about 140 articles and 8 books and all. I've been turned down by political science departments that would normally, if I were a mainstream political scientist, would have snatched me up with my credentials. So that kind of thing goes on all the time. The worst attacks on my person and my physical safety came on a university campus by campus police and state troopers in Illinois during the Kent State Uprising, where I was beaten to a pulp, my head covered with blood, and thrown into prison and sentenced to 2 years for mob action and assault and battery. It was during the anti-war demonstration days. And I remember sitting in the prison and hearing one of the cops outside say, "That's Parenti. Now the chancellor will want us to throw the book at him." And they did, we had a judge trial. I didn't go to prison. I didn't serve it. I did 2 years of probation because I was out of town and I was already at another school. But I never really got tenure, and was always hounded in that way. The students I found were often open to the message. It depended on where. Some schools they weren't. Some of them, when you get to the really well-to-do, elite, careerist kids, they often could be very unreceptive. But it varied from place to place. But it's hard for me to say. I'd say there's a lot of people on campus who are receptive if approached in the right way and if allowed to speak and if you're allowed to listen and have discourse. But it's not easy. We never promised you a rose garden, but we have to keep fighting, not for the abstract principle of democracy. It's a necessity. It's a necessity for the survival of what little shreds of rights we have, to keep those and to advance those and push. To the extent that we have those rights, it's people who have been struggling, women, minorities, African Americans for centuries have been struggling, fighting against all sorts of odds, oppression, prejudice, calumny, slander, violence, murder, all these things. Working people have been fighting and fighting. We didn't get the 8-hour day on a platter. That took a century of struggle. And in fact, we're losing the 8-hour day now with forced overtime or forced underemployment or whatever else. So we are facing very vicious people, very, very vicious people, very relentless in defending their privileges, their power, and their wealth. They will put a bullet through your head if they think you are a real danger. And so the only safety and security we have is in our numbers, in our organizing, in our speaking out. The one thing you should do, the last thing you should do with this censorship is never censor yourself. And there's all sorts of, I've run into too many people in my life who've always told me that the best way to preserve my freedom of speech was to keep my mouth shut. And that didn't make sense. Thanks a lot.
This evening, we will bring you several viewer call-in programs from the site of the Republican National Committee summer meeting in Houston, Texas. You will have an opportunity to talk with Clayton Yeiter, chairman of the Republican National Committee, and Congressman Guy Vanderjack, chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee. Those live call-in programs will begin at 6 o'clock Eastern Time today. Coming up shortly, a hearing concerning current events in Ethiopia.